Hey guys, tonight we slip past the polished castle gates and torchlit banquet halls and wander into the cold, stone-cold reality of medieval mornings. You probably won't survive this, not without a few shivers, some stiff joints, and the kind of hunger that makes a loaf of bread look like gold. But let's be honest, you're not actually there, so consider yourself lucky. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a floor that's as cold and unforgiving as the morning air seeping through the cracks in the walls. There's no mattress hugging your back, just a straw-filled pallet that has flattened over countless nights of tossing and turning. You rub the chill from your arms and consider your options. Roll out or pretend the floor is a sauna and embrace the numbness. Your family or maybe just the chickens crowd around you. Yes, chickens. They sleep inside the home because vermin control is a luxury reserved for richer folk. You probably expected a medieval home to smell like roses, but today it smells of smoke, damp straw, and yesterday's stew. You stumble toward the kitchen, which is really a corner with a hearth, a pot, and a few utensils crudely carved from wood. You're hungry, but breakfast is more idea than reality. Thin gruel of barley or oats, sometimes sweetened with a smattering of honey if the family is fortunate. If not, water and grains will do. You swallow it slowly, knowing that in another hour you'll be hauling buckets of water from the well or chopping firewood until your arms feel like lead. Historians still argue whether the gruel was genuinely nutritious or just a convenient filler, but your stomach doesn't negotiate philosophy. The morning chores begin immediately. You tend to the animals, cows, goats, pigs, each with its quirks. You might trip over a goat while trying to milk a cow, cursing softly in a tongue your great-grandparents might recognize. There's a rhythm here, a rough poetry in cleaning stalls, repairing fences, and fetching eggs before the sun fully rises. You learn quickly that medieval life doesn't forgive slacking. A dropped bucket can spill not just water, but your day's productivity. And yet, there's a weird sense of pride. The day's labors are tangible, the sweat real, and your hands are already stained with work before most people have even had coffee. You join them reluctantly, your task list longer than your energy reserves. Historians still argue whether these children truly enjoyed these mornings or if nostalgia has painted a rosier picture. From your perspective, it's chaos wrapped in mud, the kind that seeps into your socks and refuses to leave. You scrape the muck from your nails and wonder if life always feels like this gritty, unrelenting push. Even the weather seems cruelly timed. A chill bites through your wool tunic and your cloak is little more than a thin curtain against the wind. You hug yourself, wishing for the warmth of a hearth you haven't tended yet. Every breath is a visible puff. Every step leaves an impression in the frost. You've probably thought the Middle Ages were romanticized by candlelight and knights in shining armor, but you're discovering that romance is often just frostbite with a good story. Fringe sources suggest some peasants carried small charms for warmth, tiny amulets dangling around their necks to invite the sun indoors. Skeptical, sure, but imagine tying your hope to a carved piece of bone because you have no heating system. Desperation makes for creative superstition. Breakfast finished, you move to the fields, or maybe the loom, or the millstone. Your role is dictated by birth, skill, and necessity. The land doesn't rest because humans are tired. Horses pull plows in neat lines, but you're not sitting comfortably on a seat. You trudge behind, mud squishing in your boots, back aching, lungs burning. There's a rhythm to this labor, a kind of dance between you and the earth. But the music is harsh. The thud of wooden mallets, the snapping of twine, the occasional lowing of a cow that's particularly stubborn. Historians still argue whether medieval farming efficiency was actually impressive or if modern hindsight exaggerates survival feats. You don't care. You just hope you don't tear a tendon before lunch. If you're lucky, you stumble across something edible along the way. A wild berry, a mushroom of uncertain origin, or a handful of herbs for flavor. Taste tests are a gamble. Fringe historians suggest some peasants might have nibbled on roasted insects for protein. Don't wrinkle your nose just yet. Some insects are practically snack food. And yes, your stomach is queasy, but your body craves anything resembling nutrition. You make a mental note that the word breakfast might be too generous for what passes today. By mid-morning, the sun climbs higher, but it's deceptive. The cold still lingers in the shadows, and your limbs ache from both exertion and the stiffness of the pre-dawn chill. You pause to stretch, leaning against a tree, watching other villagers haul their own burdens. Some sang faintly, a tune carried on the wind, meant to lift spirits or perhaps curse fate. You notice small details, a bird's nest tucked under a rafter, a child giggling while chasing a goat, the blacksmith's hammer sparking against iron. These tiny pieces of life feel almost magical against the harshness, reminders that even the toughest reality has moments of wonder. You return home, feet soaked, hair damp from the morning mist, hands calloused and dirty. The day's first chores are behind you, but the list is endless. Laundry, fetching water, preparing meals for the next round, tending fires, mending tools, stitching torn garments. Your back aches again as you lift a heavy basket of wet clothes. You probably imagined medieval mornings as quiet or quaint, but they're loud, persistent, and unrelenting. Yet in the background, there's a certain rhythm, a constant buzz of life. This is the heartbeat of medieval existence. Early rising, relentless labor, punctuated by small victories and minor joys. As noon approaches, the first real meal is served. Maybe a thicker broth or a slice of black bread with cheese, or perhaps a small egg if luck favors you. Your stomach remembers the morning's hunger and devours what it can. You notice how flavors are heightened by scarcity. Salt is rare, spice is rarer, and every bite is savored in a way modern life can't replicate. Fringe historians claim some families added crushed shells to bread to extend it textural novelty or digestive challenge. You decide. Historians still argue whether this was common or merely an occasional hack for desperation. You chew slowly, appreciating that every meal is a hard-earned reward rather than an entitlement. By afternoon, your body is acclimated to the grind. You trudge from field to forge, from hearth to garden, and the weight of tasks becomes a familiar companion. Every movement counts. Every tool is an extension of your body. You pause only to admire small victories. A perfectly plowed row. A loaf that rose without collapsing. A fence repaired just in time before the livestock stampedes. You can't help but notice that even in hardship, life sneaks in tiny wins. And strangely, there's a rhythm to exhaustion, a kind of sleepy meditation that you carry with you. Evening creeps in, dragging shadows across the village. Smoke curls from chimneys, animals settle, and the sounds of labor fade to low murmurs. You trudge home, tired but content, hands and feet raw, stomach full enough to keep sleep at bay for a while. You glance at your neighbors' homes, noting similar routines, similar struggles. There's a quiet camaraderie in shared hardship, an unspoken acknowledgement that everyone fights the same daily battle. Fringe tales suggest some villagers whispered to their livestock at night. Offering apologies or thanks it might be superstition, or just loneliness speaking through soft murmurs. Historians still argue whether these rituals were common or symbolic gestures. Either way, they reveal the human desire to find connection, even in stone, straw, and cold air. By candlelight, you prepare for night. Maybe a simple prayer, maybe a song hummed softly. Your body is stiff, your mind wandering, and sleep calls like a distant friend. You roll onto your straw pallet, pulling a thin blanket around you. You notice the floor is still cold, the air still damp, and yet, there's comfort and survival. In having lived through the relentless morning, the endless chores, the small triumphs. You probably imagined medieval life as epic and dramatic. But here it is. Raw, tactile, challenging, strangely beautiful in its persistence. As your eyelids grow heavy, you remember the rooster will rise before dawn, and the cycle begins again. But for now, you exhale, sink into the mattress of straw, and let your body rest, knowing you've earned this fleeting peace. The sun has climbed higher now, and you trudge back into the realm of food, or what passes for it. Medieval meals aren't Instagram-ready platters. They're functional, survival-driven, and often surprising in the most unsettling ways. You probably expected golden pies or roast chickens on every table, but reality is a little grayer, with the occasional splash of color from a vegetable that survived the frost. Today, your plate, or rather, a wooden bowl's filled with a thin porridge, perhaps barley or oats, seasoned sparingly with salt, or sometimes nothing at all. Yet even this modest fare is a daily luxury. Grain shortages are common, and what you can grow in your own garden or barter for at the market is the difference between hunger and famine. Historians still argue whether medieval diets were adequate for laboring bodies or barely enough to keep you upright. You don't have the energy to care as you scoop the mush into your mouth. Food isn't just about sustenance, it's about survival, ritual, and superstition. You notice the quirks of medieval culinary life, sprinkling salt to keep evil spirits from spoiling the meal, or eating the first slice of bread backwards to ward off illness. Fringe sources suggest some peasants even believed bread soaked in urine could cure certain fevers. Don't worry, you're not trying that today, but the idea lingers as a testament to desperate creativity. Your stomach growls, a reminder that eating is both a chore and a relief. Even nobles, who get richer spreads, rely heavily on bread, cheese, and seasonal vegetables. Roast meats appear occasionally, often in the home of someone who has just been paid or sold surplus goods. But the typical peasant rarely experiences such extravagance. You walk toward the garden or a small field to see what's growing, the earth soft under your feet. Vegetables like cabbages, leeks, and onions dominate. Fruits are seasonal and unpredictable. You probably didn't expect turnips to be a staple, yet here they are, humble and persistent. You remember the last market visit. You traded a few eggs for a handful of herbs, maybe a carrot, feeling like a medieval economist calculating a precise barter strategy. Historians still argue whether peasants really enjoyed these meals or if endurance disguised resignation. Either way, your fingers are blackened from dirt as you pull weeds or harvest roots, marveling at the small victories of a vegetable that survived another frost. Meat is rare, and when it appears, it's often unusual. You might get rabbit, goat, or pork, sometimes salted or smoked for preservation. Fish shows up in riverine regions or during religious fasting periods when the church dictates no meat is allowed. This leads to creative culinary improvisations. Smoked eels, dried herring, or even fermented fish sauces that make your modern nose recoil. Fringe historians claim that some villagers fermented honey and herbs to create early mead soups, a concoction part beverage, part nourishment. You probably won't try it unless desperate, but medieval innovation often meant survival. You chew slowly, appreciating the effort behind every morsel. Grain is king, though, and bread dominates your meals. Dark rye or coarse barley loaves are common, dense and filling. You tear off pieces with your fingers because utensils are rare, and every crumb counts. Wealthier households enjoy white bread made from wheat, but even that is heavy on symbolism, status, power, and access to better milling. You recall hearing that some peasants added crushed eggshells or chalk to bread when flour ran low on extreme measure. Yes, but proof that hunger drives creativity. Historians still argue whether these additives were occasional emergencies or normalized practices. Either way, it reminds you that medieval survival often balanced on the edge of improvisation. Spices are a luxury you mostly dream about. A pinch of pepper, a scrap of saffron, a dash of cinnamon. These are the aromatics of nobility. For peasants, herbs grown in small gardens are the primary flavoring. Parsley, thyme, sage, or whatever else survives frost and pests. You run your fingers over leaves, inhaling their faint scent, and notice the tiny miracle in each sprig of green. Fringe evidence suggests that some households believed planting certain herbs near doorways could protect against illness or bring good fortune, mixing the practical with the mystical. You'll probably roll your eyes at the superstition, but the ritual becomes comforting, a way to make meals feel intentional rather than purely functional. Breakfast and midday meals are often thin and repetitive, yet the evening meal is slightly more substantial. By the time the sun begins to dip, you prepare a thicker broth with vegetables or perhaps a bit of meat, depending on luck. You notice that meals are communal. Everyone gathers around the hearth or a shared table. Hand scraping bowls, elbows brushing against neighbors. This is not merely sustenance, it's connection. Stories are exchanged, minor disputes resolved, and laughter echoes, despite fatigue. Fringe historians suggest some households even practiced early happy hour rituals, passing a bit of ale or cider around to elevate spirits, though this was mostly for adults and sparingly. Historians still argue whether these small social meals had any real nutritional impact or were mainly morale boosters, but the psychological effect is tangible. Hunger shapes everything. You trudge back to the fields after the brief meal, stomach still grumbling, muscles aching from labor. Your energy is carefully rationed, a silent negotiation between willpower and necessity. You notice that food scarcity drives resourcefulness. You eat what others discard. Dry herbs for months, save bones for broth. You might even forage for wild nuts or berries, carefully identifying what's safe to eat. Fringe sources claim that some peasants tasted moss or bark when desperate, less appetizing than it sounds, yet edible in a pinch. You probably won't make it a habit, but survival is rarely glamorous. Fasting days imposed by the church punctuate your meals. Meatless Fridays and Lent bring creativity and frustration in equal measure. You swap pork for fish or beans, grains for legumes. You might even find yourself praying over a simple bowl of porridge, hoping the gods appreciate your humble efforts. Historians still argue whether fasting improved health or simply increased malnutrition risks among the poor. You chew slowly, thinking that at least your hunger now feels purposeful, tethered to faith rather than chance. Even the act of storing food is complex. Smokehouses, root cellars, and salt pits are your allies. You trudge down to the cellar, checking on potatoes, onions, or cured meat, and marvel at the ingenuity required to survive months of frost and scarcity. Fringe accounts suggest some peasants buried grain in sealed clay pots under the floor to hide it from thieves or rodents. Historians still debate whether such measures were widespread or the exception, but the logic is undeniable. When survival is uncertain, every precaution counts. You feel the cool air of the cellar, the faint smell of damp earth and stored crops, and realize that the act of preparing for scarcity is almost as essential as eating itself. By late afternoon, your stomach no longer screams, but lingers in low, constant protest. You realize that medieval life teaches a new relationship with food: reverence for what you have, patience for what you lack, and creativity in preparation. Every meal is a story, a negotiation with resources, weather, and faith. Fringe historians even note that some villages kept feast days for purely morale purposes, celebrating with extra bread, butter, or a rare fruit to mark time and lift spirits. You probably wouldn't call it luxury, but after a day of labor, it feels like a small miracle. As evening falls, you sit down again, hands dirty from work, eyes tracing the fading light through narrow windows. The smell of simmering broth rises, mingling with the scent of damp wood and the faint tang of herbs from your garden. You tear another piece of bread, dip it in the liquid, and savor the texture and warmth. Hunger has dulled, replaced by contentment, the kind born from effort, not convenience. Fringe tales suggest some families even sang softly over meals, a lullaby of gratitude or superstition. Historians still argue whether these practices were comforting rituals or attempts to maintain morale amid relentless labor. Either way, they add a human warmth to what might otherwise feel like drudgery. By nightfall, you glance at the remaining food, mentally preparing for tomorrow's scarcity. Each meal, each bite, is a victory, a testament to endurance and ingenuity. The medieval diet isn't glamorous, but it teaches respect for sustenance, attentiveness to seasons, and awareness of survival's fragility. You've probably assumed you'd miss modern conveniences more than this. But the simplicity of the day's fare, the satisfaction of honest hunger, and the communal sharing make it oddly grounding. You roll up the remaining cloth napkins, wash what you can in cold water, and store the leftovers carefully. You'll need them tomorrow, when the cycle begins again. Night draws in fully, and you sit by the fire, chewing a final piece of bread or sipping thin ale, letting warmth seep into your bones. The day's labors are behind you, yet your mind lingers on the strange beauty of sustenance, how even the humblest meal carries history, superstition, and survival. You close your eyes briefly, listening to the wind whistling outside, smelling smoke and herbs, feeling both fatigue and satisfaction. Food is never just food, a reflection of life, struggle, and the uncanny resilience of humans across centuries. By mid-morning, you feel the lingering hunger from your sparse meals easing. But it's quickly replaced by another, more insistent awareness. Your body is being called to work. You trudge toward the fields, the blackened boots squelching in mud, the chill still clinging to your spine. Labor is relentless in medieval life, a constant test of endurance, skill, and ingenuity. You've probably imagined knights lounging between battles or peasants idling in meadows, but here, the reality is brutal. Your back aches, your shoulders scream, and every joint complains about being dragged into action before sunrise. Yet even in this strain, there's a rhythm, a pulse that the villagers share, an almost hypnotic cadence of repetitive motion. You take up the wooden plow, guiding it through stubborn earth. The soil resists, clumping under the iron-tipped share, and your arms tremble under the weight. You notice the oxen struggling too, their breath clouding in the cold air, tails swishing to ward off flies even in the early spring chill. You probably think modern farming is complicated, but it's easy to underestimate medieval labor. No tractors, no machinery, only sweat, muscle, and endurance. Fringe historians suggest some peasants whispered to oxen, murmuring encouragement or apologies for the harsh yoke and almost ritualistic communication with the beasts. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or genuine animal husbandry strategy. But the tenderness seems human, regardless. By mid-morning, your fingers are calloused and cracked, blisters forming from wielding a hoe or hammer. The tasks vary depending on the season. Sowing seeds, repairing fences, chopping firewood, tending livestock. You probably didn't expect such diversity in labor, yet every day demands flexibility and quick problem-solving. A misaligned fence can mean escaped pigs, lost crops, or worse, a day wasted. You notice neighbors calling to one another across the field, coordinating tasks, offering advice, or issuing light-hearted jabs. Even amid hardship, there's a social rhythm, a shared understanding that life is brutal, but collective effort softens the edges. You pause to adjust the wooden yoke, and the ache in your back makes itself known in sharp reminders. Every medieval tool is heavy and poorly balanced, designed for durability, not ergonomics. You probably assumed medieval peasants were simply accustomed to the weight, but every lift, every swing, strains the body in ways modern hands rarely experience. Fringe sources suggest that some laborers wore leather padding or improvised braces to protect joints rudimentary. Support systems that hint at early ergonomics. Historians still argue whether these methods were widespread or localized innovations. But either way, the human drive to adapt is clear. Midday arrives, but there's little pause for rest. A quick sip from a shared water vessel, a bite of bread torn from a sack, and back to work. The sun climbs overhead, burning through mist and fog, and sweat dampens your tunic. You trudge through fields already familiar with your footfalls, soil compressed by countless others before you. You notice subtle differences: the texture of clay, the scent of wet straw, the sharp tang of manure fertilizing the crops. Fringe historians claim that some farmers believe certain smells warded off disease or evil spirits, combining practicality with superstition. You probably chuckle at the idea, but you're beginning to sense that belief and survival are often inseparable. Accidents happen often. A misstep on uneven ground, a sudden snap of a rope, or the oxen veering unexpectedly can lead to minor injuries or worse. Bandaging is rudimentary. Herbal poultices and compresses are your primary medicine. You remember that one villager swore by a concoction of garlic and honey for any wound, claiming it healed faster than prayer alone. Historians still argue whether these remedies had genuine efficacy or were psychological comfort, but in the absence of hospitals, any hope counts. You dab at a scraped hand with cold water, silently marveling that survival often relies as much on improvisation as skill. Work continues through the afternoon, and your muscles develop a dull, satisfying ache. You notice patterns: the earth giving way at certain points, the plow digging deeper when the soil is wet, the rhythm of the oxen mirroring your own exhaustion. There's a subtle interplay between human and environment, a constant negotiation that requires attention, patience, and experience. Fringe historians note that some medieval farmers marked fields with small charms or symbols to encourage growth, a curious mix of superstition and early agricultural science. You probably roll your eyes at the thought, but can't deny that rituals, no matter how odd, provide structure to relentless labor. Around mid-afternoon, you switch tasks. Perhaps mending nets for fishing, repairing a roof, or sharpening blades for the next day's work. Every movement is precise. Every mistake has consequences. You probably expected leisure between chores, but medieval labor is an unbroken chain of necessity. Fringe sources claim some villagers sang softly while working, partly to coordinate movements and partly to lighten the mental load. Historians still argue whether this was habitual or occasional, but even a simple hum provides a brief respite from physical strain. In the workshop, the smell of sawdust, metal, or clay fills your senses. You shape tools, repair wagons, or craft everyday items for the household. The tactile satisfaction is tangible: the smooth curve of a handle, the snug fit of a hinge, the predictable resistance of wood beneath your knife. You probably thought medieval artisans had leisure to perfect their craft. But even they worked under the pressure of necessity. Broken tools halt production, unsharpened plows ruin crops, and every object must serve function before beauty. Fringe accounts suggest some craftspeople embedded small charms in handles or beams, hoping to ensure durability or ward off misfortune. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or subtle marketing, but the psychological comfort is undeniable. Back outside, you assist with water transport. Buckets are heavy, paths muddy, and the sun's heat is relentless. You notice minor injuries: blisters, scrapes, bruises common and mostly ignored. Some villagers carry simple herbal remedies, others rely on raw endurance. You probably expected a more sanitized picture, but medieval labor accepts pain as an ordinary companion. Fringe historians note that certain magical plants were carried as talismans against fatigue or injury, practicality dressed in superstition. Historians still debate whether these practices were psychological crutches or genuine beliefs. Either way, you pause to take in the rhythm of effort, realizing that survival is as much mental as it is physical. By late afternoon, your body is humming with exhaustion. The repetitive tasks have created a meditative state. You notice patterns in the land, subtle changes in the light, the distant sound of village activity. Even minor victories: a well-placed post, a smoothly dug trench, a repaired tool feel monumental after hours of relentless work. You've probably imagined medieval days as either leisurely or endlessly dire. But in truth, They are both structured chaos and survival choreography. Fringe accounts even suggest that some peasants timed their work with sun positions, almost as if guided by celestial rhythms, blending practicality with a touch of poetry. As evening approaches, you begin the slow walk home, carrying the weight of tools, harvested goods, or buckets of water. Your shoulders sag, knees ache, and your hands are roughened by constant use. Yet there's a satisfaction in knowing the day's labor will feed your family, protect your home, and maintain the fragile rhythm of survival. You glance across fields where others trudge along, noting the shared endurance that binds the village together. Fringe historians claim some communities even mark the day's end with small rituals, a nod to completion and gratitude. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual or social, but it's clear that human ritual is as old as labor itself. By nightfall, muscles still humming, you settle briefly by the hearth, eyes tracing flickering flames and catching glimpses of neighbors' weary smiles. Stories are exchanged, minor complaints voiced, laughter bubbling through exhaustion. You probably thought medieval evenings were dark and silent, but there's a subtle energy, a quiet camaraderie born from shared toil. You stretch, sip water, and let the warmth seep into your bones, knowing tomorrow will demand the same relentless effort. Labor isn't just survival, it's a language, a negotiation between body, land, and community. And for all its grueling weight, there's a strange satisfaction in participating. Finally, when the hearth dims and the village settles, you retreat to your humble pallet. Every ache, scrape, and blister tells the story of the day. Your body, though exhausted, is alive in a way modern comfort rarely demands. You probably won't appreciate this until later, but medieval labor shapes not just survival, but identity, embedding resilience, creativity, and endurance deep into your muscles and memory. As you close your eyes, muscles humming and mind drifting, you realize that work is both punishment and poetry, and you've walked through hours that few modern eyes ever truly see. You step back into the house, or what passes for it, and immediately notice the pungent mix of smoke, animal odor, and damp straw that clings to every surface. The walls are thick stone, cold and unyielding, absorbing every whisper of wind that slips through cracks or gaps in the roof. You probably imagine medieval homes as quaint cottages with flower boxes and tidy hearths, but reality is raw and unforgiving. Animals share the space with humans, chickens scratching in corners, a dog curling beside the hearth, perhaps even a goat or pig if the family is particularly poor. Their smells mingle with yours, the scent of sweat and earth forming a pungent perfume of survival. Historians still argue whether such proximity to animals was truly necessary for warmth or more a matter of convenience and tradition. Your sleeping area is modest, a straw-filled pallet, roughly stitched blankets, and maybe a thin wool tunic to serve as a pillow. You trudge across the floorboards, cold seeping through your bare feet, and settle into your makeshift haven. The texture of straw under your body is uneven, poking at you with tiny reminders that comfort is a privilege in medieval life. Fringe historians suggest that some families lined pallets with leaves or soft moss when they could, attempting to soften the blow of stone and straw. You probably wouldn't call it luxury, but it's an improvement, a small triumph over the harshness of your environment. Cooking takes center stage next, the hearth alive with flickering flames. You notice that the kitchen is really a corner with a fire pit, a few iron pots, and wooden utensils that have seen better days. You trudge over to fetch water or stir a simmering stew, mindful of soot-streaked walls and the occasional errant spark. You probably imagined a clean kitchen with gleaming pots. But here, everything is practical, worn, and layered with history. Fringe accounts suggest some households kept small charms near the hearth to ward off fire or bad luck while cooking. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or mostly localized superstition, but the ritual provides reassurance nonetheless. Survival in this environment is as much about observation as instruction. You probably imagined kids frolicking in fields, away from labor, but here they are, part of the rhythm, learning the dance of chores and responsibility early. Fringe sources suggest some children carried tiny amulets for luck, while helping adults, a mix of superstition and playful imagination. Historians still argue whether these charms had social significance or were simply imaginative toys, but they clearly add color to the daily grind. The hearth radiates warmth, but it barely reaches the far corners of the home. You notice shadows flicker against rough-hewn beams, walls etched with the fingerprints of previous inhabitants. You probably assumed homes were tidy and orderly, but medieval life is messy and alive, full of fingerprints, soot, and the marks of labor. Every surface tells a story. The stain on the wall where a pot once spilled, scratches from animals, the tiny indentations from years of foot traffic. Fringe historians claim some families painted symbols or marks on walls for protection or luck, blending practicality with superstition. Historians still argue whether these markings were functional or symbolic, but they clearly imbued the space with meaning. Meals are modest yet communal. You sit around a low wooden table or simply on the floor, sharing thin bread, vegetables, and maybe a sliver of meat. You probably thought dinner would be more extravagant, but medieval food is sustenance, not spectacle. The act of eating together creates a rhythm, a social glue binding family and neighbors in shared endurance. Fringe tales suggest that sometimes a small portion was deliberately set aside for spirits or ancestors, a ritual that blends respect with superstition. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or limited to certain regions. But the gesture speaks to humanity's desire for connection beyond the immediate. Evening chores follow the meal. You fetch water from the well, sweep away straw and debris, tend to animals still milling in corners, and repair torn garments or tools. Every movement reinforces survival. Every task a testament to persistence. You probably imagined that after a meal you could rest, but the cycle of work continues, even if the sun dips behind the hills. Fringe accounts note that some villagers hummed or sang quietly during these chores, partially to coordinate effort and partially to keep spirits lifted. Historians still argue whether these songs were routine or occasional, but their presence demonstrates the human need for rhythm and morale. You take a brief pause to reflect on the home itself. Cramped though it may be, it contains all the necessities: food, warmth, shelter, and community. You notice the small windows, often shuttered with wood, letting in just enough light. You trudge past storage areas where grain, herbs, and tools are carefully stacked, evidence of constant negotiation between scarcity and abundance. Fringe historians suggest some families concealed extra food or valuables in hidden compartments beneath floors or inside walls, a quiet strategy against theft or misfortune. Historians still argue whether these hiding spots were common or exceptional, but the ingenuity is clear. The day's work winding down, you attend 2 minor repairs: patching a leaky roof, fixing a door latch, or mending a woven basket. You probably imagined medieval homes as static, but in reality, they require constant maintenance. Each day, a negotiation with time and the elements. Fringe sources suggest that some families painted protective symbols near repairs, blending superstition with practical labor. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic or genuinely believed to prevent structural failure, but it adds another layer to domestic life. As darkness deepens, you light a small candle or lamp, casting a soft glow over the room. The warmth of the fire mingles with flickering light, shadows dancing across walls and beams. You sit back, exhausted, tracing the lines of a well-worn table, the rough texture of wood under your fingers. You probably expected medieval evenings to be quiet and lonely, but the home is alive. Children whispering, animals shifting, neighbors arriving briefly to exchange news or goods. Fringe historians note that some households engaged in storytelling at night, weaving myths, local history, and moral lessons into these brief gatherings. Historians still argue whether such tales were primarily entertainment or educational. But they clearly provide comfort and connection. Before bed, you attend to personal cleanliness as best you can. Water is scarce, privacy minimal, but even a quick wash at the basin or by the hearth offers relief. You notice the faint scent of herbs, soap, or smoke lingering on the skin. You probably thought medieval hygiene was non-existent, but practices varied. Herbs, scrubbing with rough cloths, and communal washing offered some semblance of care. Fringe accounts suggest some families applied animal fats or plant oils to protect skin from cold or chapping. Historians still argue whether these were primarily practical or symbolic, but they show the ingenuity in managing comfort amid harsh conditions. Finally, night descends fully. You trudge back to your pallet, laying straw carefully to create a semblance of comfort. You wrap yourself in a thin blanket, listening to the sounds of the home settling. Chickens clucking softly, dogs breathing steadily, wind whispering through cracks in the walls. You've probably expected silence or stillness, but medieval homes are alive, constantly moving, breathing with the lives inside. Fringe historians suggest some families left a candle burning overnight, a quiet talisman against darkness and spirits. Historians still debate whether this was ritualistic or practical, but it's another layer of care woven into daily life. You close your eyes, muscles sore from work, hands calloused from labor, heart still carrying the rhythms of the day. You reflect on the strange comforts of your home: warmth, shelter, community, and the small rituals that make life bearable. You probably assumed medieval domestic life was purely hardship, but here you see the resilience, the improvisation, and the subtle joys that emerge even in limited space. Animals, chores, meals, and rituals weave together to form a tapestry of survival, one thread at a time. The home, cramped, smelly, and uneven, is a place of continuity, protection, and subtle delight, proof that even in hardship, humans create spaces of care, routine, and meaning. You drift into a heavy, deserved sleep, the flicker of firelight casting soft shadows on the ceiling, the rhythm of the home enveloping you. Outside, the world continues, but inside, you are momentarily safe, momentarily at peace, carried by the persistent heartbeat of daily life. You probably won't remember every detail in the morning, but the texture of the day, the smells, the warmth, the fatigue, and the tiny comforts remain etched into memory, a quiet testament to life behind closed doors in the medieval world. Dawn arrives again, soft and gray, and you feel the tug of faith weaving through the day. Religion dominates medieval life, not as an occasional backdrop, but as a constant presence. You probably imagined medieval devotion as silent and solemn, but it is as practical as it is spiritual, as terrifying as it is comforting. The bell tolls from the local church or maybe a chapel tucked between houses. You trudge toward it or pause at the sound, adjusting your pace to its rhythm. The village is alive with murmurs, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional bleating of livestock, all forming a chorus that blends with the sacred call. Historians still argue whether religious participation was genuinely voluntary or socially enforced. But either way, you feel its grip from the moment your eyes open. You enter the small church, wooden pews creaking beneath your weight. Candles flicker, their soft glow illuminating carved saints with chipped faces, faint remnants of paint and gold leaf. You probably didn't expect such artistry, yet much of it is rough, a reflection of limited resources rather than lack of devotion. Fringe accounts suggest some parishioners whispered prayers to saints for absurdly specific needs, like preventing a neighbor's goat from escaping. You might roll your eyes, but the precision of petitioning shows the intimate, everyday relevance of faith. The priest recites prayers in Latin, some of which you understand, most of which remain incomprehensible, yet their cadence is hypnotic, a rhythm that guides both mind and body. The rituals are public and private at the same time. You kneel on cold stone, chest pressed against the floor or a rough bench, imagining that you are part of something larger than your own village, your own narrow life. You probably thought medieval piety was a matter of fear alone, but all wonder and genuine reverence are threaded through the acts of lighting candles, offering coins, or bowing at a relic. Fringe sources claim that some villagers left offerings in hidden corners for protective spirits, not sanctioned by clergy, but deeply meaningful. Historians still argue whether these acts were considered heretical or simply folk devotion tolerated by authorities. Either way, you feel the human need for ritual, reassurance, and connection. Daily prayers punctuate work, meals, and even moments of leisure. You might pause while plowing to whisper a line, tilt your head while feeding animals in recognition of divine oversight, or bless the meal before eating. You probably didn't anticipate such integration of faith into routine, but it is seamless, a constant thread linking survival to spiritual guidance. Fringe tales suggest some villagers even recited prayers silently to protect tools or crops, blending superstition with devotion in ways that seem strange but make perfect sense in context. Historians still argue whether these practices significantly impacted behavior or were more psychological comfort, but their presence is undeniable. Church attendance itself is more than mere obligation. Festivals, holy days, and saints' feasts create punctuated time markers in an otherwise monotonous life. You notice the village transforming during major celebrations, streets filled with music, dancers, and tables laden with rare foods. You probably imagine these moments as extravagant, but even modest peasants participate enthusiastically, dressing in best tunics, carrying small offerings, and joining communal dances or processions. Fringe historians claim that some rituals included symbolic acts like stamping feet in unison to chase away evil spirits that seem theatrical today. Historians still debate whether such rituals were primarily spiritual or social, but they clearly bind the community together. Fear is an inseparable companion. Hellfire sermons, threats of divine punishment, and the invisible gaze of God are reminders that choices carry cosmic weight. You trudge past neighbors heading to confession, seeing the mix of anxiety and relief on faces. You probably thought religion was only comforting, but medieval life entwines awe with dread, morality with social control. Fringe accounts suggest that even children carried small charms or recited protective prayers to guard against illnesses, a blend of superstition, education, and fear. Historians still argue whether this fear improved adherence to societal norms or simply intensified anxiety, but its influence on daily life is unmistakable. Education, when it intersects with religion, is peculiar. Monks, priests, or sometimes local teachers instruct a few children in literacy, often focused on religious texts rather than practical knowledge. You notice the rhythm of learning intertwined with prayer, letters and prayers repeated until memorized. Comprehension secondary. Fringe sources claim some children practiced mnemonic chants that were half spell, half prayer, a curious fusion of learning and ritual. Historians still debate the efficacy of such techniques, but the commitment to religious education is remarkable, especially for those with limited time and resources. Even at home, faith permeates mundane tasks. A woman baking bread may sprinkle it with salt while murmuring a blessing. A farmer sowing seeds pauses to cross himself. A blacksmith mumbles a prayer before striking glowing metal. You probably didn't imagine prayer as so seamlessly integrated, yet it becomes part of the rhythm of survival. Fringe accounts suggest that some tools, like knives or plows, were inscribed with tiny crosses or symbols for divine protection. Historians still argue whether these were magical thinking or symbolic faith, but they demonstrate the human desire to merge labor with divine oversight. The calendar itself dictates behavior. Lent, Advent, and Saints' Days require modifications to diet, work, and social interaction. You notice villagers adjusting routines, swapping meat for fish, or refraining from festivities during solemn periods. You've probably assumed religion only influenced moral guidance, but it shapes everything: what you eat, when you labor, and even how you interact with neighbors. Fringe historians suggest some people timed marriages, harvests, or construction projects around auspicious holy days, blending practicality with spiritual observance. Historians still debate the precision and prevalence of such timing, but the interplay between faith and daily life is undeniable. Even nighttime carries religious undertones. You kneel beside the pallet before sleep, offering a prayer or reflection, imagining that angels guard your home, your family, and even your livestock. You probably expected sleep to be a secular reprieve, but here it is, both physical and spiritual. Fringe accounts describe families keeping tiny images or relics near beds for protection, superstitions overlapping with genuine belief. Historians still argue whether these practices were deeply held convictions or mere cultural remnants, but they reveal the medieval mind's intertwining of the sacred with the mundane. You drift toward sleep, the day's work behind you, your body aching and your spirit soothed by the rhythm of faith. You probably won't remember every prayer or ritual, but the pattern lingers: know, fear, routine, and comfort. Religion is never simply abstract. It permeates the touch of bread, the scent of the hearth, the murmur of animals, and the murky light of dawn. You rest, wrapped in the physical and spiritual layers of your home and your world, carried by a rhythm centuries in the making, where survival, devotion, and superstition flow seamlessly together. The bells will toll again, and the cycle of faith, labor, and endurance continues. The day drifts onward, and you begin to notice how medieval people carved brief moments of pleasure from their otherwise unrelenting lives. Play, song, and amusement are as vital to survival as bread and firewood, even if you probably assumed joy was a luxury reserved for nobility. Fringe sources suggest some games involve simple wagers or storytelling competitions, blending play with early forms of social negotiation. Historians still argue whether these amusements were purely for fun or served as tools for social cohesion and skill building. Either way, you watch and understand the necessity of distraction. Songs drift through the air, carried on voices hoarse from labor or laughter. You probably thought music was confined to courts and grand halls, but the village hums with its own tunes, simple melodies, repeated refrains, and improvised instruments made from scraps of wood, strings, or hollowed gourds. Even work itself has a rhythm enhanced by song, whether a farmer chanting while plowing or a washerwoman tapping a ladle against a basin in time with the water. Fringe historians suggest that some tunes included coded messages, gossip, or moral lessons disguised as entertainment. Historians still debate the intentionality behind these songs, but you can't deny their function in creating connection and joy. Games, too, appear in modest forms: tossing stones, rolling hoops, simple dice games, or rough-and-tumble contests of strength and agility. You probably assumed medieval recreation was overly structured, but it's spontaneous, flexible, and heavily reliant on imagination. A stick can become a sword, a puddle can host a race, a handful of pebbles can determine the fate of a playful wager. Fringe accounts claim some village games had ritual significance, mimicking seasonal or agricultural cycles, blending amusement with symbolic practice. Historians still argue whether this symbolism was consciously understood or merely coincidental, but the creativity is undeniable. Even adults participate, often under the guise of necessary distraction from labor. After the day's chores, you might find villagers gathering around a fire or at a communal space, playing simple board games, engaging in storytelling, or listening to a traveling musician. You probably thought adults labored without pause, but even peasants find pockets of relief. Fringe historians note that some adults incorporated small bets into games or challenges, not for wealth, but for honor or bragging rights. Historians still debate the prevalence and social impact of such practices, but the human need for diversion is universal and unchanging. Storytelling is particularly powerful. You sit cross-legged on the dirt floor, watching a neighbor spin tales of clever thieves, ghostly apparitions, or heroic deeds from generations past. You've probably imagined such stories as purely fictional, but many contain moral lessons, warnings, or reflections of village experience. Fringe accounts suggest that some stories were intentionally altered to teach lessons about risk, obedience, or cleverness, functioning as a sort of informal education. Historians still argue whether these narratives were primarily entertainment or moral instruction. But the effect is undeniable. Listeners are captivated, laughing, or gasping in turn. Festivals punctuate routine, offering extended relief from labor. You trudge to the village green for a feast, a dance, or a public performance. Music, food, and playful chaos dominate, and the community bonds in ways impossible during ordinary days. You probably thought celebrations were reserved for nobility or church occasions, but local feasts, harvest festivals, and saint days create pockets of exuberance for all classes. Fringe historians suggest some festivals included ritualized games representing seasonal transitions, blending entertainment with spiritual or agricultural symbolism. Historians still argue about the prevalence of these traditions, but the joy is evident in every shouted cheer and stomping foot. Humor permeates these interactions. You notice teasing, playful pranks, and exaggerated storytelling designed to provoke laughter. You probably assumed medieval humor was crude or grim, but it's often clever, relying on wordplay, timing, and shared experience. Fringe accounts suggest that some humor was directed at authority figures in coded ways, allowing villagers to safely vent frustration. Historians still debate whether these forms of humor were socially sanctioned or subtly subversive, but they undeniably foster resilience. Even in the fields, play and amusement sneak into labor. A farmer might challenge a neighbor to a race while carrying a sack of grain. Children imitate adult chores in mock seriousness. And animals often become unwitting participants in games. You probably thought work left no room for levity, but amusement is interwoven with labor, breaking monotony and strengthening social bonds. Fringe sources note that some of these playful competitions mirrored seasonal contests or local rites, turning everyday exertion into subtle cultural education. Historians still argue whether participants recognized the symbolism or were simply enjoying themselves, but the effect on morale is clear. Music and storytelling extend into the evening. Around the hearth, you hear chants, short songs, or improvised melodies accompanying work or shared meals. Children mimic adult voices, adults join in, and the rhythm of the day is punctuated by sound. You probably didn't expect such pervasive musicality, but it provides both structure and relief. Fringe historians suggest that some songs contained coded messages about village events, market conditions, or personal grievances. Historians still debate the intentional complexity of these lyrics, but the communal experience is undeniably bonding. Play is also practical. Games teach coordination, memory, and social strategy, skills that may aid survival. Children racing through mud, tossing stones, or mimicking adult tasks develop physical dexterity and situational awareness. You probably assumed play was only for amusement, but these activities are embedded with life lessons, risk assessment, cooperation, and ingenuity. Fringe sources suggest that mock battles or pretend contests mirrored actual seasonal work challenges like harvesting or defending property. Historians still argue whether this was intentional pedagogy or coincidental, but the benefits to survival skills are clear. Even laughter is a form of currency. Amid exhaustion, brief joy strengthens bonds, mitigates fatigue, and provides resilience against monotony. You notice that even small jokes, teasing, or exaggerated tales carry weight. They lighten moods, reinforce social norms, and transmit subtle knowledge. You probably imagined medieval life as humorless and severe, but human nature persists in every chuckle, snort, and mischievous grin. Fringe historians claim that humor sometimes functioned as subtle social critique, a way to navigate hierarchy without overt confrontation. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but the instinct to laugh in adversity is timeless. As dusk approaches, you settle near a fire, surrounded by family, neighbors, or friends. Instruments often improvise, produce simple melodies, while stories continue, laughter punctuating the smoke-filled air. You probably didn't anticipate the immersive social fabric of pleasure in medieval life. But it's woven from necessity. Humans crave respite, delight, and connection. Fringe accounts describe spontaneous performances where children or adults dramatize tales, blending humor, music, and movement. Historians still argue whether these were informal rituals or mere entertainment. But their presence illuminates a crucial aspect of survival: emotional sustenance. By nightfall, the communal atmosphere softens. Firelight flickers across stone walls, shadows dance, and voices gradually quiet. You feel the lingering warmth of interaction, a psychological reprieve from the day's toil. You probably assumed medieval evenings were silent and somber, but here they pulse with life, memory, and amusement. Fringe historians note that some households left small tokens of playstones, carved toys, or simple musical instruments near sleeping areas, extending joy into rest. Historians still debate the prevalence, but the practice speaks to the human desire to carry pleasure even through hardship. You lie on your straw pallet, muscles sore but mind enlivened by song, story, and laughter. You remember races through mud, whispers of games, the cadence of work song, and the shared joy of small successes. You probably didn't expect medieval people to find so much lightness amid toil, but survival demands both endurance and levity. As you close your eyes, the echoes of playful shouts, soft tunes, and murmured tales drift into dreams, carrying with them the subtle lesson that even the hardest life requires moments of delight. Morning arrives slowly, the chill lingering in the air as you trudge through dew-soaked grass. Your breath visible, in short, cloudy puffs. Today, your focus turns to the realm of trade, craft, and the subtle economics that structure medieval life. You probably imagined peasants bartering occasionally at a crowded market, but in reality, trade threads through every day, every meal, and every relationship. You watch as a neighbor trudges down the lane, carrying a basket of eggs, another hauling firewood, and realize that the survival of the village depends on constant exchange, negotiation, and trust. Historians still argue whether medieval markets primarily served economic needs or social cohesion, but the interplay is undeniable. The village marketplace is alive with a symphony of sound: carts creaking, voices haggling, animals bleating, and the occasional clink of metal. You've probably assumed markets were orderly, but here chaos reigns, and yet everyone seems to navigate it instinctively. Fringe sources suggest some vendors employed small charms or rituals to ensure good sales, leaving coins under baskets or whispering blessings over wares. Historians still debate whether these acts were sincere, superstition, or performative habit. But the practice adds a rich texture to the commerce you observe. Barter dominates, though coins circulate when available. You trade eggs for cheese, a handful of herbs for cloth, or a few loaves of bread for a knife. You probably imagined coinage dominating everyday life, but scarcity dictates creativity. Fringe accounts claim some villagers used unconventional items like feathers or small stones as temporary currency in isolated contexts. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or occasional, but they demonstrate adaptability and the human instinct to negotiate value in a resource-constrained environment. Craftsmanship defines the market as much as produce. You notice a blacksmith hammering metal into tools and horseshoes, sparks flying with each strike. You've probably thought craftsmanship was confined to wealthy artisans or urban guilds, but rural skill is both ubiquitous and essential. Fringe historians suggest some blacksmiths incorporated symbolic markings on tools for luck or protection, blending superstition with utility. Historians still argue whether these symbols were primarily decorative or functional, but their presence shows the intersection of skill, belief, and survival. Trade is also competitive. You watch a merchant arguing over the quality of wool, voices rising and falling in rhythmic cadence. You probably assumed medieval trade was straightforward, but negotiation is a performative art, balancing reputation, trust, and persuasion. Fringe sources suggest subtle gestures, tapping a foot, adjusting a hat, or sliding a coin slightly forward served as nonverbal cues in bargaining. Historians still debate the sophistication of these techniques, but they clearly indicate that social intelligence is as vital as material knowledge. Crafts extend beyond tools. You observe a potter shaping clay into vessels, a weaver managing threads on a loom, and a carpenter measuring wood with careful precision. You probably didn't expect such a wide array of expertise in a single village, but necessity drives versatility. Fringe accounts describe hidden patterns or initials carved into items, sometimes for luck, sometimes to mark ownership. Historians still argue whether this was functional, symbolic, or both, but the markings reveal a human desire to leave a subtle signature, even in routine production. Religious oversight shapes trade subtly but significantly. The church enforces rules about fair weights, tithes, and ethical practices. You probably assumed commerce was entirely secular, but moral guidance permeates every transaction. Fringe historians suggest that some villagers whispered prayers over goods too. Avoid being cursed by dishonest exchange or divine disfavor. Historians still debate whether these rituals were protective superstition or genuine ethical practice, but they underline the inseparability of faith and daily life. The exchange of news is a hidden function of trade. You overhear rumors of distant conflicts, seasonal warnings about crops, or gossip about neighboring villages. You probably assumed news traveled slowly in medieval times, but marketplaces are hubs of information as much as commerce. Fringe accounts claim some traders employed coded signals or subtle marks on goods to communicate discreetly. Historians still argue the extent and sophistication of such systems, but the marketplace is clearly a node of both material and social intelligence. Specialization also affects hierarchy. Certain villagers command more respect due to skill or rarity of craft. You probably assumed social rank was rigid, but economic function provides mobility and influence within the community. Fringe historians suggest that master craftsmen occasionally trained apprentices in secret techniques, almost like passing hidden codes. Historians still debate the prevalence and exclusivity of such apprenticeships, but their existence highlights knowledge, transfer, and status negotiation in medieval life. Even mundane chores link back to trade. You help mend a fence using nails purchased from the smith, fetch water to soften clay for pottery, or carry produce to the market in exchange for essentials. You probably imagine barter as isolated, but in reality, it's embedded in every movement. Fringe sources suggest some villagers performed small rituals before exchanges, touching wood, whispering blessings, blurring superstition and economy. Historians still argue whether this affected actual trade outcomes, but the practices reveal the human impulse to combine hope, caution, and commerce. By late afternoon, the rhythm of trade winds down. Goods are stored, debts mentally noted, and relationships solidified. You probably thought economic life ended with sunset, but exchanges often extend into social spaces. A neighbor returning an egg, a quick assessment of a tool's quality, or shared advice on cultivation techniques. Fringe historians note that informal audits, like counting grain or inspecting cloth, were sometimes accompanied by prayers or charms. Historians still debate whether this reflected superstition or practical diligence, but either way, it deepens the texture of daily negotiation. Evening brings reflection on what you've learned through commerce and craft. You notice the interdependence of villagers, the subtle hierarchies, and the strategies both practical and mystical that sustain life. You probably assumed trade was merely transactional, but it's deeply human, reliant on trust, skill, communication, and occasional levity. Fringe accounts describe some traders performing small rituals after successful exchanges, leaving coins in specific arrangements or marking tools with symbolic lines. Historians still argue about the exact meaning, but the behavior illustrates that survival is always intertwined with belief, ingenuity, and community. At night, you return to your humble home, carrying minor goods or repairs. You lay down items, inspect tools, and organize provisions for the next day. You probably didn't expect trade to occupy so much mental space, but medieval life constantly negotiates scarcity, skill, and foresight. Fringe historians suggest that some families maintained hidden stores of materials or secret tools as a precaution against theft or poor harvests. Historians still debate the prevalence, but the impulse toward preparation is undeniable. By the time you settle near the fire, you reflect on how economic life shapes rhythm, community, and personal identity. You've probably assumed medieval villagers were passive, reacting to circumstance, but in truth, every step, every negotiation, barter, and exchange requires strategy, observation, and improvisation. Fringe accounts even claim that certain traders used symbolic markings on sacks or baskets to encode origin, quality, or intended recipient. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or isolated ingenuity, but the effect is clear. Information, skill, and superstition combine to sustain life. Finally, you lie down on your straw pallet, muscles sore from labor, hands blackened by work, yet the mind is alive with reflection. You probably didn't expect trade, craft, and daily economy to carry such subtle complexity, but the intertwining of survival, skill, and human ingenuity becomes clear. You close your eyes, listening to the faint murmurs of neighbors, the occasional bark of a dog, and the distant tolling of a bell, recognizing that every exchange, physical, social, or spiritual, builds a web of life that sustains your world. As sleep drifts in, you carry the rhythms of barter, craft, and communal effort into dreams, realizing that even in hardship, the medieval world is alive with strategy, creativity, and quiet triumphs. The morning light is muted, filtered through clouds and the high, uneven windows of your home. Today, your focus drifts toward the intricate web of health, hygiene, and medicine in medieval life topics that feel simultaneously familiar and alien. You probably imagined medieval medicine as either rudimentary or superstitious, a core malesh, but it is a strange mix of practical knowledge, observation, ritual, and outright guesswork. You trudge toward the small apothecary corner where dried herbs hang from beams. Jars line rough shelves, and the faint scent of vinegar, lavender, and something more pungent, perhaps sulfur, lingers. Historians still argue whether medieval remedies were effective or primarily psychological, but you notice the care invested in preparation, dosage, and storage. You trudge to a basin to wash your hands, the cold water biting your skin. And remember that bathing was infrequent by modern standards, yet hygiene was embedded in subtle routines. You probably imagined constant filth, but villagers practiced practical cleanliness, washing hands before meals, rubbing flour or sand on skin to scrub away sweat, and using herbs for deodorizing. Fringe accounts claim that some villagers applied mixtures of animal fat and plant oils to protect skin against the cold or to heal minor abrasions. Historians still argue whether these methods were primarily medicinal or protective, but they reveal an intuitive understanding of care and preservation. Minor injuries are common. You notice a neighbor wrapping a scraped knee, mumbling a prayer, or applying a poultice of honey and crushed herbs. You probably imagined wounds treated only with crude bandages, but observation and experimentation inform practice. Fringe sources suggest that some poultices included unconventional ingredients, like animal dung or fermented substances which were believed to accelerate healing. Historians still debate their efficacy versus placebo effect, but the underlying principle of topical treatment persists. Illness is a constant threat. Seasonal fevers, gastrointestinal troubles, and infections can sweep through a village with alarming speed. You probably assumed that rural isolation provided immunity, but outbreaks ripple through populations swiftly. Fringe historians claim that villagers sometimes burned aromatic plants in homes or wore sachets of herbs to purify the air. Historians still argue whether these measures reduced disease or simply comforted the anxious, but they illustrate a human impulse to intervene, even against invisible threats. The role of midwives, healers, and informal doctors is crucial. You notice a woman preparing a herbal infusion, grinding leaves and roots with a mortar and pestle. You probably assumed formal medical professionals dominated treatment, but in reality, knowledge resides in households, passed through observation and experience. Fringe accounts claim that some remedies were transmitted through secretive rituals, verbal codes, or family-specific recipes, adding an element of mystique. Historians still debate how much of this knowledge was empirically effective versus symbolic, but the effort to understand and heal is clearly evident. Mental health, too, is addressed in subtle ways. Villagers recognized stress, grief, and exhaustion through observation and communal care, even if not named as such. You probably assumed psychological distress was ignored, but small gestures, shared meal, a song, a storytelling session serve therapeutic functions. Fringe historians suggest that some rituals, like walking barefoot through dew or reciting protective prayers, were used to alleviate anxiety or ward off evil humors. Historians still argue whether these practices were psychologically or spiritually motivated, but their effect on morale is tangible. Nutrition interweaves with health. You trudge to the larder, examining dried grains, salted meat, and fermented vegetables. You probably imagined medieval diets as dull and monotonous, but seasonal variety exists. Foraged greens, berries, and mushrooms complement staples. Fringe sources claim that certain combinations of foods were believed to balance humors, preventing illness or enhancing vigor. Historians still debate whether dietary theories were scientifically grounded or symbolic, but they significantly influenced meal planning and food preparation. Physical activity itself is a form of preventive care. You trudge across fields, lift heavy loads, and manipulate tools, unwittingly maintaining strength, flexibility, and endurance. You've probably assumed medieval life was more sedentary than it actually was, but survival requires constant motion, which incidentally fortifies the body against fatigue and disease. Fringe historians suggest that some villagers performed ritualistic movements or stretches to maintain vigor, blending superstition with functional exercise. Historians still argue whether these movements were systematic or improvised, but their benefits remain clear. Sleep is another layer of health. You notice that mattresses are sparse, but layering straw, cloth, and furs provides insulation. You probably imagined comfort as non-existent, but people adjusted sleeping arrangements based on temperature, age, and family structure. Fringe accounts describe rituals performed before bed, touching talismans, whispering protective prayers, or leaving small offerings to spirits to ensure safety. Historians still debate whether these actions affected sleep quality or were primarily psychological comfort, but they highlight the human desire to impose order and protection over vulnerability. Hygiene extends to sanitation, a topic you probably assumed was completely neglected. Waste management is crude, often involving simple latrines, communal pits, or river disposal. Yet villagers adopt practical strategies, rotating areas, covering waste, and using ash or straw to minimize odor. Fringe historians suggest that some communities placed small charms or plants near latrines to protect against disease or spirits, blending practicality with belief. Historians still argue about the significance of these measures, but they illustrate a complex negotiation between environment, health, and superstition. Medicine, hygiene, and diet intertwine with social norms. You observe neighbors sharing remedies, instructing children on care, and exchanging herbs or advice across fences. You probably imagined each household as isolated, but community knowledge networks exist, circulating solutions and cautionary tales. Fringe accounts claim that minor disagreements sometimes revolved around the efficacy of remedies, with villagers asserting lineage-based authority or secret knowledge. Historians still debate the actual accuracy versus cultural prestige, but it emphasizes the role of observation, experimentation, and social negotiation in sustaining life. You notice that some villagers employ symbolic acts alongside practical care, sprinkling water, placing herbs under pillows, or leaving protective symbols on doors. You probably imagine superstition as frivolous, but it merges with observation to form a holistic approach to survival. Fringe historians suggest these rituals enhanced adherence to routines, creating mental frameworks for vigilance and caution. Historians still argue whether the efficacy was spiritual, psychological, or both, but the behaviors persist as a testament to human ingenuity. As night falls, you trudge toward your pallet, mindful of the body's demands and the subtle rituals that protect it. You wrap yourself in blankets, feeling the layered warmth of straw, wool, and furs. You probably assumed medieval care was purely reactive, but it is proactive, anticipatory, and interwoven with belief. Fringe accounts describe whispered prayers over sleeping children, small herbal pouches tucked nearby, and symbolic gestures marking boundaries against misfortune. Historians still debate the widespread accuracy or intent of these practices, but they represent a holistic understanding of health, body, mind, and spirit in continuous dialogue. Finally, you drift toward sleep, muscles fatigued, mind alive with observation, and the subtle comfort of layered care enveloping you. You probably won't remember every detail, but the texture of the day, the interplay of herbs, ritual, diet, movement, and community remains imprinted. Medieval life, you realize, is not merely survival. It's a complex negotiation between observation, practice, belief, and endurance. Health is an ongoing, intricate dance where practicality and superstition intertwine seamlessly, ensuring the village persists day after day, guided by knowledge, ritual, and human ingenuity. The morning light is dim and golden as you trudge across the village paths, carrying the weight of daily labor, but also a growing awareness of the subtle networks that shape medieval survival. Social alliances, feuds, and unspoken codes of behavior. You probably imagine medieval communities as simple and static, but relationships, obligations, and influence thread through every interaction. You notice neighbors greeting each other with a careful mix of familiarity and caution, small gestures carrying meaning beyond politeness. Fringe sources suggest that even minor actions like lending a tool or offering bread could signify alliances or debts of honor. Historians still argue whether these codes were formally recognized or socially improvised, but their power is palpable. Trust is currency in this world. You trudge past someone tending livestock, aware that gossip, reputation, and reliability determine access to resources, information, and protection. You've probably assumed medieval people relied solely on coercion or force, but cooperation is equally essential. Fringe accounts claim that villagers sometimes used secret signs, knocks, hand gestures, or marks on property to signal safety, intent, or alliance. Historians still debate how widespread or standardized these signs were, but they reveal a sophisticated, if subtle, social intelligence. Marriage, family ties, and kinship reinforce these networks. You notice a young couple exchanging glances while carrying water. Their actions guided not just by affection, but by social expectation and strategic alliance. You probably imagined romance as entirely private, but in reality, family negotiations, dowries, and alliances dictate much of social mobility. Fringe historians suggest some families orchestrated matches to consolidate influence or access scarce resources, blending affection with strategy. Historians still argue the degree to which personal choice factored in versus social obligation, but the interplay is clear. Dispute resolution is practical, embedded in local norms. You observe two villagers negotiating over a fence boundary, their conversation careful, gestures deliberate, tension restrained by habit and consequence. You probably imagined conflicts ending in immediate violence or feuding, but subtle negotiation often prevails. Fringe accounts describe informal mediators, often elders or respected craftsmen, guiding resolution through ritualized language, oath-taking, or symbolic gestures. Historians still debate whether these processes prevented violence systematically or merely deferred it, but the structure of mediation is evident. Work obligations reinforce social hierarchies and cohesion. You trudge to the field, observing who takes the lead in plowing, sowing, or repairing structures. You probably assumed hierarchy was rigidly feudal, but respect is earned through skill, reliability, and shared labor. Fringe sources claim that villagers sometimes tested newcomers or youth with small tasks to gauge character and competence. Historians still argue whether this was primarily social ritual or practical assessment, but it underscores the interdependence of labor and social trust. Reciprocity underpins survival. You notice a neighbor sharing firewood in exchange for eggs, another assisting with repairs in anticipation of future help. You probably thought barter was purely transactional, but social obligations extend beyond immediate exchange. Fringe accounts suggest that some families maintained unwritten favor ledgers, a memory of debts and obligations, reinforced by stories or songs. Historians still debate the prevalence and reliability of such memory systems, but they emphasize that trust, reputation, and mutual aid are woven into daily existence. Hierarchy is nuanced. You observe how a master craftsman receives deference. A skilled hunter is consulted on local animal behavior, and an elder's advice is followed even by the physically stronger. You probably imagined power as purely material or feudal, but influence derives from expertise, reliability, and accumulated social capital. Fringe historians note that some individuals maintained secret knowledge herbal remedies, hidden water sources, or local legends that enhanced authority. Historians still argue whether this knowledge was truly guarded or simply respected culturally, but it creates layers of respect and influence. Conflict avoidance is an art. You notice subtle cues, a glance, a shift in posture, or a change in tone that signals caution or deference. You probably imagined feuds erupting spontaneously, but much of village life revolves around careful calibration of speech and action. Fringe accounts suggest that even jokes and storytelling carried layers of meaning, reinforcing alliances or lightly chastising behavior. Historians still debate the extent to which humor functioned as social regulation, but its presence is unmistakable. Celebration and ritual reinforce social bonds. You trudge to the village square for a festival, noticing how structured roles, music, and dance create order amid the exuberance. You probably imagined festivals as chaotic, but they are orchestrated events, balancing authority, tradition, and enjoyment. Fringe historians suggest that some rituals encoded messages about status, fertility, or alliances, blending social signaling with entertainment. Historians still argue whether participants consciously recognize these layers, but the outcome's solidarity, joy, and subtle negotiation are clear. Even routine work carries social weight. You trudge beside a neighbor repairing a roof or tending livestock, observing how conversation, cooperation, and shared labor transmit knowledge, reinforce bonds, and navigate hierarchy. You probably imagined daily chores as solitary or mechanical, but every movement, every exchange is socially charged. Fringe sources claim that some tasks included symbolic gestures, like tapping tools 3 times or arranging items in a specific pattern to honor tradition or signal competence. Historians still debate the intention and prevalence, but these habits deepen cohesion and structure. Hospitality is another crucial thread. You notice villagers offering tea, bread, or shelter to travelers, neighbors, or kin. You probably assumed hospitality was occasional or perfunctory, but it is a strategic relational practice that strengthens alliances and ensures mutual aid. Fringe accounts describe small rituals accompanying hospitality, placing herbs by the door, whispering blessings, or offering protective charms, merging practical generosity with spiritual caution. Historians still argue about the consistency of such practices, but they reveal a culture attentive to both social and metaphysical security. By evening, the village pulses with quiet understanding, rituals, and unspoken codes. You trudge home, reflecting on alliances forged, debts acknowledged, disputes mitigated, and shared labor performed. You probably imagined medieval social life as simple, but it is a delicate tapestry of trust, obligation, knowledge, and negotiation. French historians note that subtle acts of courtesy, gift-giving, and ritual performance carried layered meanings, reinforcing cohesion and hierarchy. Historians still debate the complexity and prevalence, but the patterns are clear. Survival is both physical and social, relying on observation, cooperation, and nuanced understanding of human behavior. As night falls, you lie on your straw pallet, muscles aching but mind alert to the invisible threads that shape every action. You reflect on alliances, hierarchies, obligations, and trust, realizing that medieval survival is as much about social intelligence as physical endurance. You probably won't recall every subtle interaction, but the texture of the day, the interplay of negotiation, cooperation, and observation remains etched in memory. Life is a constant balance between individual effort and communal dependence, a delicate dance orchestrated by human insight, superstition, and shared labor. The morning arrives soft and cool, and you trudge along familiar paths, noticing how the rhythms of the village, its people, and its labor have become almost second nature. Today, your attention settles on the intimate and often hidden routines that govern domestic life, the spaces where survival, comfort, and identity converge in quiet, unremarkable moments. You probably imagined medieval homes as harsh, Spartan boxes, but each room, each hearth, and each tool tells a story of adaptation, resourcefulness, and subtle luxury. Historians still argue whether domestic comfort was primarily functional or symbolic, but the evidence of care is everywhere you look. You step into the main room, where the hearth dominates. Flames crackle in a bed of coals, smoke curling up the chimney, carrying the scent of yesterday's stew and smoldering herbs. You've probably assumed fire was only for cooking, but it also provides warmth, light, a locus for family gatherings, and even spiritual reassurance. Fringe sources suggest that some families sprinkled protective herbs into the fire, believing the smoke purified the home or warded off misfortune. Historians still debate whether this was widespread superstition or occasional ritual, but it adds a sensory richness to your understanding of daily life. The furnishings are modest but telling. A rough wooden table shows evidence of repeated carving, scratches, and dense marks of meals, lessons, and games. You probably imagined furniture as purely functional, but even small details reveal personality, care, and attention. Fringe accounts claim that families sometimes carved symbols into furniture, blending aesthetic, spiritual, and mnemonic purposes. Historians still argue whether these markings were practical, decorative, or protective, but their presence suggests that even in austerity, medieval people sought connection with their surroundings. Storage and organization follow practical rhythms. Baskets of grain, sacks of flour, and rows of dried herbs line shelves or hang from beams. You probably assumed medieval homes were cluttered chaos, but there is order, a logic dictated by space, access, and necessity. Fringe sources describe families hiding small valuables in hollow beams, under floorboards, or inside kitchen implements, blending secrecy with security. Historians still debate how pervasive this practice was, but it illustrates the intersection of ingenuity and risk management. Kitchen life is vibrant and aromatic. You trudge toward the hearth, noticing pots, pans, and tools arranged for efficiency. You probably imagined cooking as a solitary, laborious task, but it is often communal, involving conversation, instruction, and even playful competition. Fringe historians suggest some recipes included ingredients believed to enhance luck, fertility, or health, mixing pragmatism with superstition. Historians still argue whether these additions were meaningful or symbolic, but they reveal the layered complexity of everyday survival. Food preparation blends ritual, skill, and practicality. Kneading dough, chopping vegetables, and tending the fire require both attention and timing. You probably assumed medieval meals were crude, but seasonal variety, preserved foods, and carefully layered flavors show sophistication. Fringe accounts claim that certain herbs or spices were used not only for flavor, but for symbolic protection, carrying subtle messages of care or status. Historians still debate the intent and impact of these choices, but the result is a culinary landscape both functional and culturally rich. Water management and sanitation occupy constant thought. You trudge to the well or nearby stream, aware of its centrality to domestic life. You probably imagined medieval hygiene as universally neglected, but careful routines, boiling, straining, storing, and rotating water reflect observation, habit, and precaution. Fringe sources suggest that some households placed protective charms near water sources, believing them to prevent illness or misfortune. Historians still argue about the efficacy and prevalence of such practices, but they reveal a constant negotiation between practical need and metaphysical concern. Laundry and clothing maintenance are laborious but essential. You trudge through basins, scrub cloth, and hang damp garments across beams. You probably assumed garments were worn until they fell apart, but care, repair, and preservation are routine. Fringe historians note that some clothing carried symbolic stitching or embroidered motifs intended to protect the wearer or denote identity. Historians still debate whether these were primarily aesthetic, functional, or ritualistic, but they indicate that even mundane tasks are imbued with meaning. Domestic chores often double as instruction. Children observe, imitate, and gradually participate in cooking, cleaning, and tool use. You probably imagined learning as formalized only in schools or monastic settings, but much of it happens informally at home. Fringe accounts claim that families used small mnemonic devices, songs, rhymes, or symbols to teach complex tasks. Historians still argue whether these devices were widespread, but they reveal a sophisticated oral and observational pedagogy embedded in daily life. Storage and sleeping arrangements reveal social and practical strategy. You notice furs layered on straw pallets, blankets folded with care, and space allocated by age, gender, and family role. You probably assume sleep arrangements were entirely functional, but consideration of comfort, warmth, and hierarchy is evident. Fringe historians suggest that families positioned small charms, herbs, or personal tokens near sleeping spaces, blending superstition with practicality. Historians still debate the prevalence and intent, but the patterns underscore a layered approach to domestic security and personal comfort. Household maintenance extends beyond immediate family. You trudge through minor repairs, tending roofs, mending tools, and patching walls. You've probably assumed these were sporadic tasks, but they are ongoing, essential to survival and social perception. Fringe accounts describe rituals like knocking on beams before repair or sprinkling salt in corners believed to prevent structural failure or misfortune. Historians still debate the intent, prevalence, and efficacy, but the combination of care, superstition, and observation defines domestic life. Even leisure is domestic, intimate, and socially woven. You notice shared stories, singing, and simple games among family and neighbors. You probably assumed relaxation was a public affair, but private spaces are full of subtle pleasures. A quiet tale, a soft tune, or a shared laugh around the fire. Fringe historians suggest that even minor storytelling carried coded moral instruction or reinforced social norms. Historians still argue the conscious intent, but the effect of emotional and social reinforcement is undeniable. By dusk, the day's labor winds down, and the household hums with gentle rhythm. Food prepared, tools stored, children rested, and knowledge transmitted. You trudge to your pallet, aware that each small act from washing dishes to arranging herbs, practicality, care, and subtle ritual. You probably didn't imagine domestic life as so richly layered, but survival, comfort, and identity are inseparable in these moments. Fringe accounts note that families sometimes maintained private shrines, tucked items, or whispered rituals, merging domesticity with spiritual vigilance. Historians still debate prevalence, but the impulses reflect universal human desire for order, safety, and connection. As night settles, you close your eyes on straw, furs, and blankets, feeling the textures of home-hard beams, soft fabrics, warm hearth, and lingering scents. You probably won't remember every detail, but the intricate choreography of domestic survival, infused with care, observation, skill, and ritual, leaves a lasting impression. Life here is a continuous negotiation of comfort, practicality, and subtle ceremony, demonstrating resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet artistry of everyday living. You drift into sleep, carried by the rhythm of routine, memory, and gentle reassurance that even in hardship, home is a sanctuary of continuity, care, and human touch.